to Broker Chat. As you know, we are going to start doing this every other Monday. The brokers, we got together in the 5 offices and decided that maybe weekly was a little bit overkill for you guys. It gives you a chance to go out there and make some mistakes and then come see us at 12 to talk about them. Not just mistakes, some successes as well. So thank you all for attending. I think I'm very, very excited about today because we have 2 fantastic people online today to talk to us about compliance. I know we always want to know how to get new business and lead generate and what's the best script and so on and so forth. But if you don't have your license, none of that matters. And so today, everything is about compliance. Are you in compliance when it comes to actually filling out contracts, what you say to people? Are you violating any kind of HUD or fair housing or GREC policies, procedures, and standards of practice? And today we have Ned Blumenthal, who is with Wiseman Law in the Buckhead office. He's a partner with that firm. And I've known Ned and Seth. I knew Seth, Ned, by the way, back when Seth was the attorney for a condo I lived in on Powers Ferry, and they were very lively. That's how I met Seth. And he's also from Pennsylvania, and so am I. So that's kind of how we've known each other for quite some time. Ned is also the co-author of our Red Book. Now, I know we're all Keller Williams and we call something the Red Book, but the Red Book keeps you out of trouble. And it's in its sixth edition. If you haven't already purchased it, it's online now. I think I saw it on Barnes & Noble as well as Amazon, and I'm sure Ned will follow up with what I'm saying about that. I think it's actually 2 volumes this time. I ordered that as well, and I think that's just behind right now because of COVID and publishing. So for now, if you don't have that book, I do have it online. Jason has access to it when he needs it. And as soon as we get a book, we'll have a physical one as well. I kind of like a book. We will talk a lot about, what happens when you're sued or what happens when you want to sue. And is it really worth doing that? Ned also is a litigator with the Wiseman firm, and he represents agents, brokers, developers, builders, people of that nature. And he's also litigated in federal and state local courts. So this is the perfect person. I thought it was me and Jason, but no. We have the grand poobah on. And then of course we have our own Jason Hammock with the Midtown office. He's our productivity coach, as well as checking some of you, especially the newbies, on compliance. He does help Darcy review contracts, and he usually doesn't reach out to me unless he sees something that's constant or we really need to catch that person, like when you don't fill out your lead paint exhibit, which is real important right now and real serious. So without further ado, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to let Ned and Jason take over, and we'll start with Ned. And Ned, you take it away. And what we'll do, we'll leave a few minutes after, about 15 or so minutes for questions. So please, if you've ever felt like you were crossing the line, this is a safe space. You've got the one and only person who could answer that question. So please don't be shy about asking questions. Ned?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to at least virtually see everyone. I'm Ned Blumenthal, and every time I do a presentation like this, there's a rumor out there about me that I always have to address. And it's true, I'm a recovering realtor. It's been 30 years, and the shaking has just gotten so much better, gradually improving little by little. And for the last 30, going on 31 years now, I have spent most of my time defending real estate agents and brokers. The good news is that we've been relatively successful doing this. The bad news is that we've been incredibly busy doing this. And right now, these are dangerous times. I mean, they're phenomenal times and crazy times in the market. Last year I just called it all just COVID crazy, and now it's just plain crazy. And some of the things that I'm saying are just kind of mind-boggling, and you all see it as well. I wake up pretty much every morning trying to figure out how I can make the world a safer place for real estate agents and brokers. And the wheels have kind of come off that cart right now. Probably the best thing I can tell you from a just global perspective, and admittedly incredibly hard to do, but it's something that everybody needs to focus on, is we need to slow it down just a smidge, because I'm seeing just veteran seasoned agents making so many incredibly bad rookie mistakes, and they're going to get folks in trouble. I can guarantee you that 3 years from now, I will still be litigating claims that are coming up and arising right now today. But and I get it. By the time the property goes live, you've got 65 offers that have come in, and Lord, how can you possibly deal with all that? But we've got to slow it down just enough to make sure that we're just not doing the silly things like last week I had, and over the weekend, dealing with the case where somebody had, they were fortunate enough to have like a half dozen listings, which it's hard enough to find one these days. They had a half dozen of them, and the offers were flying in at the speed you would expect, and they just conflated a few of them, and they started countering back. They like pulled the offers that were coming in for 123 Smith Street, and they were forwarding them on like they belonged to 456 Jones Street, and they were just sending offers that were for the wrong property to the sellers, and the sellers didn't catch it either. And it's just been a huge debacle trying to figure that out. I've had, in the last year and a half, I've had, I think, 8 cases where we've had multiple live contracts, where you've got one seller and one property and 2, 3, or 4 buyers who all have got live contracts for the same property. I can tell you who wins those claims: the lawyers, and who loses those claims is everybody else. And it's just a simple matter, and I don't mean to be too preachy about this, but don't let your seller client sign a second contract until you've got written confirmation that the first contract is terminated. You may not be able to always get buyer number 1 to sign a TNR, but you should at least have the seller sending out a notice to buyer number 1 that says that, hey, we may have a dispute over who's entitled to the earnest money, but this is to confirm this deal is terminated, and I'm proceeding to sell the property to somebody else. Doesn't necessarily make them bulletproof, but it makes it a lot harder when buyer number 1 resurfaces a day or 2 later and says, no, wait, we still got a deal. At least you have put the burden on them by telling them, hey, wait, I consider this contract to be terminated. Correspondingly, on the flip side of that, with buyer number 2, I would not be putting a second live contract in with buyer number 2, other than making it a backup until we've gotten confirmation that the first contract is terminated, or putting in a contingency that says, in the event, essentially the parties acknowledge that there was a prior contract the seller believes is terminated, but in the event that the first buyer files a lawsuit prior to closing, the seller has the right to terminate the second contract by giving the buyer their earnest money back and $100, just to prevent these multiple live contract situations, because they're just an incredible mess, and everybody blames the agents because they view you as being the person that should have prevented this from happening and told them not to sign. And we're seeing crazy stuff at alarming rates, and you all are seeing it too. Buyers just like saying, I'm not going to buy, and sellers saying, I'm not going to sell. And you're like, but the closing's in 12 hours. What do you mean? They're like, yeah, I don't care. And they're like, well, buyer, you're going to lose your earnest money. Yeah, whatever. Seller, the buyer could sue you for specific performance. Yeah, okay. I don't have any place to go. By the time the buyer does that, it'll be 6 months to 2 years down the road, depending on how long I want to drag this out. Maybe I'll found a place by then. If the buyer's willing to wait that long, we've got buyers that are making every kind of offer known to mankind, including, we've been drafting special stipulations for buyers that say kind of the reverse of the property sold with contingent upon buyers selling their existing property. They're now saying the contract's contingent upon the seller being able to purchase some other property. And if the seller can't purchase a new place to go, then they get to terminate the contract. The buyers are using that as kind of the, what I call the pick me message, where they're trying to get in and get their offer accepted over somebody else's. All of which is fine, but just in the process, we need to slow it down. I'm seeing incredibly poorly drafted special stipulations. And this is something that is a pet peeve of mine, because it's within your control. A lot of claims that come in are not within your sphere of control, but special stipulations are. And don't be worried just about the ones you draft. You need to be worried about the special stipulations that the other side drafts too. Because if a special stipulation is drafted so poorly, it is possible that that can result in there being no binding contract at all. And so even though the seller put in a bad special stip, your buyer wants the house, the seller has now gotten 1,500 new offers on that property and realizes, gee, we undersold it. They're looking for an out. And if they've got a bad special stip, even when they drafted, if it's bad enough, they may be able to use it to terminate the contract. And then, of course, the agent, the buyers are looking at you for, hey, why did you warn us about this? I don't think it's possible to draft a proper special stipulation in less than 2 or 3 fully complete sentences. And we really need to avoid industry jargon in them. The one I typically chuckle over is where they say a clean termite letter is to be provided. I mean, I guess it means no coffee stains on the termite letter, and it's clean. You need to think about, what would a disinterested third party, we'll call a judge, what would they think that means? And even though I may have some idea, being in the industry, what you mean by clean, do I really? Does that mean that there are just no active termites in the property? Or does it mean that there's no evidence that there have ever been active termites in the property? Does it mean that we know that there's no damage from any prior infestation in the property? You really need to almost play lawyer with the special stipulations and cross-examine them. And in your business, what makes you successful is you're always thinking about we're going to get this done. We're going to keep positive, stay positive. We're going to get it done. And with special stips, you really need to do just the opposite of that. You need to say, okay, how could this blow up? Have I answered? Who's going to do it? When are they going to do it? What happens if they do it? What happens if they don't do it? And really address the whole litany of how could this possibly be used by the other side to try to torpedo this deal? Because we're running across that a lot. One thing that I'm seeing, and I guess it's no surprise given the market that we're in, is I'm sending out an incredible number of demands to buyers and sellers saying that, hey, you breached the contract and you had no basis for doing so. You owe a real estate commission and you need to pay it or else. And so everybody who's listening understands there's something about the dynamic in a buyer or seller who's going to rip somebody off for their real estate commission. If you charge something on your Amex bill and you don't pay Amex and they send you a couple of letters and you ignore them, they file suit, and 99 times out of 100, you just default. You don't even put up a fight. For some reason, if somebody does the same thing, but not to Amex, but to their broker, and the broker says, you owe me a commission, 99 times out of 100, that person, when they get sued, they fight like mad. They come back and they just, I don't know what the psychology is of it, but they fight like crazy. And not only do they necessarily say, most of the time they say, not only do I not owe it, but agent, it's your fault that something went bad in this deal. And so not only do I not owe you a commission, but I'm going to counterclaim against you and sue you for negligence or fraud or whatever else they can come up with. So that means that triggers your E&O, and now we're into your deductible. You're now paying not only a bunch of money on the front end to pursue the commission claim, but you are also paying all the defense costs as well and running through the case. You can't also then just turn around and immediately dismiss your commission claim, because the other side still got the claim pending against you. So I'm sending a lot of demand letters, but as a practical matter, unless it's just a really large commission, I generally don't recommend that you actually file suit over it. If somebody most people that I know that like litigation tend to be lawyers. Most normal people, non-lawyers, don't seem to like litigation so much for some reason. And I would, happy to file claims, and that's what I do, but I spend more time trying to talk people out of pursuing commission claims than just about anything else, because it's just not worth it. I mean, there's so much more productive stuff you could do. And we had one that just got resolved about a month ago, and we've spent close to 2 years fighting the case. And by the time it was over, the agent who was so gung-ho about we need to pursue this was the one begging, please, can we just make it go away? Because they were sick of being through the ringer on this thing for days and weeks and months on end as it went through. Just a lot of issues with that. I did have one that came up yesterday. I get calls all the time where people were like, oh, I got one I bet you never heard before. And I'm usually like, oh yeah, 3 times last week I heard that. But I had this one come up last week, and it was a new one. So the agent goes out to list the property. Hooray, they found the listing. It exists. They found the listing. They go out and they do what they're supposed to do, which is they hand the seller's property disclosure statement to the seller, and they say, seller, you need to complete this on your own. I'm here to help you if you have any questions, but I cannot complete the form for you. And part of the story is the take-home message. You cannot ever, your pen, your pencil, your digital pen should never, ever touch a seller's property disclosure statement. It should always, always only be the seller, never, ever you. No differentiation, but no explanation will suffice for why a seller couldn't or wouldn't do one, and that you had to. It's only the seller, or don't have one at all. Anyway, the seller did what they're supposed to do in this case. They filled it out, and they came back and gave it back to the listing agent. And they said, I've completed it, but I do have a question. I'm not sure whether this is something I need to disclose or not. And if I do, I'm not sure where to put it. The agent said, okay, well, tell me what's going on. And they said, well, sorry, this one's just too bizarre. A few years ago, my husband died. We had him cremated, and his ashes were mixed into the interior paint. It's just kind of like, you what? What? My immediate reaction was, well, yeah, I don't think we need to disclose that, because what you should be telling the seller is that they need to rip out all of the drywall that has been painted and put in brand new drywall, and then don't worry about the disclosure. But the more I started thinking about it, I'm not 100% sure that that qualifies as a defect. I mean, if the paint's been on the wall for a few years and it's not chipping or flaking or anything, I don't know that it technically constitutes a defect. But you got a seller who, for whatever crazy reason, did this and has now voluntarily told the listing agent that they did it. Probably they have told the neighbors. And you know what's going to happen as soon as somebody moves in, the neighbors are going to show up, and it's going to be, oh, nice paint job, huh? And they may not have a legal claim, but that's not going to stop them from going out and potentially suing everybody, or frankly, sometimes worse, getting on social media and just trash talking you. And so, ultimately, even though the legal answer wasn't necessarily that you have to disclose, it was, oh yeah, if the seller doesn't rip these walls out and fix it, then yeah, you're going to disclose, or maybe you're just going to pass on this listing. As blasphemous as that sounds in this market, still the case that not every client is worth having.
Hey, Ned, there's a
Yes.
question in the chat that says, is it material notice?
You mean as a material defect, I guess? Is that what we're talking about?
They put material notice, but I think they mean material defect.
Yeah, I don't know that it is. I mean, certainly if you have the buyer, if you've got a client relationship with the buyer and you know that somebody's ashes are painted into the wall, yeah, you're going to tell them that, because it's, everything that you know about that is pertinent to the transaction. And, there are many buyers who, would run miles from that home and would never touch it. And we probably got some Walking Dead fans out there that would pay more just because of it. So it's not necessarily that it's going to scare everybody, but it is something that I think most buyers would certainly want to know. And whether but it's material, but I don't know if it's a defect in the strictest sense. If it's something where we know that the structural integrity of the walls has been compromised somehow, then that certainly is a defect. But if it's just something that's in the paint, it's not clear. But I had never run across that particular issue before. So there are still some things out there that I guess can surprise me.
Ned, let me interrupt you here. I'm going to go back to special stip. There was another question when we're doing special stips. I think Jason, you want to go ahead and jump in and ask that question. And by the way, for those of you that are on Zoom, if you look in the chat, Jason was kind enough to put the special stipulations from our GAR. When I teach contracts, I always give everybody a copy of the special stips index as well as the forms index. And I would study that and highlight the special stips that you probably will use. 9 times out of 10, you won't use most of the special stips that are on there. But there's probably a handful that will always come up in your career at some point. Jason?
Yeah, what I put in the chat underneath the special steps, a fabulous woman that I know taught me many years ago to ask what needs to be done, who needs to do it, when does it need to be done, what happens if it's not done, what happens if it is done, how do we know that it's been done? And like Ned said, a 1-sentence special stipulation is not going to answer all of those questions, so that is why I put that there. But I think from a compliance standpoint, and Ned, thank you so much for being here, because I love that I get to ask you this. Like you said at the very beginning, there's a lot of agents out there that are playing fast and loose, and they're very experienced agents. And what I'm seeing while I'm doing compliance reviews, I'm seeing things being left blank. Like, the legal description, for God's sake, isn't defined in the contract, but the only thing there is the address. And this is a binding contract for 3 weeks now. And from one of the questions that sometimes pops up in my head is, how does the attorney actually close that when the contract is incomplete like that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's, if you don't have the legal description in, so the rule is that the contract has to at least provide a key, which will lead unerringly to basically what dirt we're talking about. Can we use that? So oftentimes a street address is insufficient to do that. Put down 123 Smith Street, Atlanta. Well, there may be 2 or 3 123 Smith Street, Atlanta's out there, and we don't know what we're talking about. Or, it may have some adjacent acreage that or a parcel that's attached to it. And without that, it's really an unenforceable agreement. It's not really a contract. Same thing. We saw this. I ran across this last week where somebody left out the interest rate and the financing contingency. It's a void contract. If you don't have all those boxes filled in, you don't have a binding contract. Now, sometimes it cures itself, like if you don't have a legal description, but as long as the parties, buyer and seller, sort of remain true to their intentions and word, and they're both on the same page, at some point, the closing attorney probably goes and pulls what they think is the legal description from the deed, the vesting deed, into the seller, and they circulate that around and say, is this what we're talking about? If everybody's on board with it, then it closes. But there have been plenty of times where that doesn't happen. They pull it and they're like, hey, what property are we talking about? And again, if everybody, back a million, 100 years ago, spit in a handshake, you could do a deal. Not true today. And if you have anybody who's having buyer's remorse or seller's remorse, suddenly the closing attorney says, hey, we're missing a legal description. Whichever side's got remorse is suddenly saying, we don't have a contract. Mm-hmm. And they're right. So and you don't know in advance whether that's going to be beneficial or harmful to your client. But the preference by far, of course, is to do it right, make sure that we've got a legal description. And it's not very hard, you know, everybody knows. You go ask your seller for, hey, where's the deed where you bought the property? Just attach a copy of it, Exhibit A, and you're done. You don't have to worry about it after that. But there have been, you know, lots of issues coming up with that sort of thing. More so in the last probably 6 months that I've seen in the last probably 3 years combined, where people are just leaving stuff blank because I think they're just moving way too fast. And there's also,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, there's also just sort of there's nothing we can do about this other than trying to set examples for others, you know, being good stewards of the special stipulations, catching them on the front end and just saying, hey, you sent over this special stip. I'm not sure if this is what you meant or not. Can we get clarification on what it is that you actually meant to say here? Because you sent over a half of a sentence as a special stip, and I don't want, you know, while everyone's still working together, while we're still in the, hey, we got an offer that we want to accept stage, and the parties aren't like going at each other, that's the time to try to clarify this stuff, being good stewards of it, so that, you know, when we have understanding on the front end, it doesn't result in things blowing up on the back end, because nobody wants to be sitting around for a month only to have the deal blow up then. And there's also just the general, and I see it, I assume you all see it, there's a general mentality out there in the market where it's like combat real estate, you know, where everyone's got to get the other side. It's got to be the dig where, hey, we won. I mean, last time I checked it back when I was practicing, the definition of winning was we got to the closing, so we all got paid. That was the way I always looked at it. But now it's everything is kind of like, hey, you know, we got them. And yeah, okay, I get the notion. I mean, I'm a litigator, I get that. But the reality here is that buyer, and it's typically going to be the buyer, if they feel like they got at the end, they are the ones that are more likely to turn around and file suit against you on the back end after they've been in the property for a year and seen it, you know, through a change of seasons and the bumps and the warts and whatever. They're the ones that are going to, because hey, that agent, you know, on that listing side, they were so smug, they had that attitude, they told us you're stuck too bad, and you know, what else did they know about? Oh, there's something wrong with the house. I bet they knew about it too. And so I don't know. Other than setting an example, I don't know there's much we can do about that. Yes.
I want to get one more question, and that's very popular. And then we're getting to about 12:30. I want to start letting some of the agents jump in here and some of the other brokers that may be on. But
sure.
For me, the biggest one that's happening quite a bit, and I agree with you, everyone's moving too fast. And it always makes me nervous when people move too fast, because that's when mistakes happen. But the biggest one that's happening often is, let's just say there are repairs that have to be done. The buyer goes in and they do a walkthrough, or sometimes they don't do a walkthrough, and things are not complete, and everybody decides we're not coming to closing. And explain the repercussions of that and the breach of that.
Sure.
Because there are things in our contract, we have a special stip for that, but it's very, very rarely used to protect everyone. And so if it's not used, what are the repercussions? What happens? Should you show up for closing anyway, even if the other party says they're not going? And how should that be handled?
Okay. So yeah, the starting point is that the way the DYER contract reads is that any agreed upon repairs are supposed to be done in a good and workmanlike manner prior to closing. And there's a survival language in the contract that says certain things survive the closing. And one of those is anything that the parties agree should be done before closing, which includes the stock repair. So if there's a repair that's supposed to be done and it's not done prior to closing, unless we have some sort of an amendment providing that the repair will be done after closing, if you show up and close, then that repair obligation is gone. So if there's supposed to be something, the seller's supposed to do something, it's not done prior to closing, you show up as the buyer and you close anyway, then the seller no longer is obligated to do that repair. The way you fix that is you do an amendment that says that the seller will fix it within X number of days after closing. have an amendment to that effect, or you do a price reduction, or you work it out some other way. Sometimes the buyer's lender will have issues depending on how it gets worked out. And one thing to watch for there, whenever there's a reference to lender, you need to think underwriter, not loan originator, because, and I'm generalizing, but loan originators, the system is set up wrong in my estimation. Loan originators get paid to close loans. Loan underwriters get paid to not close loans, find out why they shouldn't close. And so there's a huge disincentive for the loan originator to have transparency to the underwriter. So you probably had, if not you, a friend has had a situation where the loan originator is like, oh, just handle that outside of closing. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to see it. And if you start pressing harder on that, well, why not? It'll be, well, because if underwriting sees it, they won't do the deal. And that is literally my definition of mortgage fraud. If there's something about the transaction that the underwriter doesn't know about, but if they did know about it, they either wouldn't do the deal or wouldn't do it on the same terms and conditions, that's mortgage fraud. And your DNA should not be anywhere on that. Now, if a buyer and seller want to get together on their own, totally on their own, and do whatever deal, that's on them. But you don't want to have fingerprint, an email, a text, anything that shows that you had any knowledge or played any role in that. But if you show up, so in terms of whether you need to show up at closing or not, everybody expects and hopes that the law is just sort of clear, black and white, and often it's a million shades of gray. So there's something in the law called anticipatory repudiation, which is a fancy way of saying you don't have to sit around and wait for somebody not to do what they've already told you they're not going to do. So if there's a very clear message coming from one side or the other that says, we're not showing up, you don't need to be there because we're not going to be there, period, no equivocation, then you are probably okay not to show up. The belt and suspenders answer, though, is you show up anyway, because that way you can demonstrate that you were there, you were prepared, you were ready, and the other side is the one who's in breach. So I don't want to say that it absolutely 100% needs to be that you show up every single time, although in a perfect world you would. But if there's something where it is beyond clear, and to be clear here, I mean in writing, not like, well, they said, or their tone, because that counts for nothing. It needs to be in writing where it just says, we will not be there, or something awfully close to that. And then you don't want to have another message that says, we changed our mind, we will be there, because then you do need to plan to show up. So I usually tell people, look, the only safe answer is show up anyway. But there can be exceptions, but your stock answer ought to be to your buyer or seller, whichever, it ought to be, well, I'm not a lawyer and I can't play lawyer for you. I'm not licensed to do that. This may be something you want to address with your attorney, buyer or seller, to get advice, legal advice, whether you want to show up or not show up. But my recommendation is that we should show up, because you don't go wrong telling them, hey, show up, and it turns out it wasn't needed. It only goes wrong if you tell them, oh, don't bother showing up, and it turns out that they needed to, then that's a problem.
And that's what I run into, because when the agents get into a corner of no one wants to show up, that is what I tell them. You should show up, because if it turns uglier through a lawsuit or things of that nature, then you've breached as well. You didn't show up. And I'm not an attorney, I just play one on television. So that's usually how I respond to that. And just so we cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's, even if you show up for 5 minutes to tell the attorney, we don't have anything in writing, but we believe the other party is not going to show up. So we just wanted to show face to let you know we were here, ready, willing, and able to close.
Yeah,
there was a question in the chat about should the unfinished, this was from Barbara Dyer. So Barbara, if you want to unmute and ask your question, it was about the survival of the agreement.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Ned, thank you for being here. Thank you for all the good information that you're providing us with. But my question is, if they agree to the repairs and they don't finish them before closing, does that not fall under the survival of the agreement clause?
If they've agreed to do the repairs and if the repairs aren't done prior to closing, then they do not survive. The only way that it survives the closing is if the parties have an amendment, or it could be in the contract itself, somewhere in writing, where they specifically state that the repairs can be done after the closing. And the corollary to this, a similar issue is, and I'm not sure what it is, I haven't seen it in a few years, but for a while I had like 3 or 4 cases where people had these doll houses, and they call them doll houses, but they were like, I mean, they had electrical, they were on their own foundation, they were these $100,000 like playhouses that were in the back of the property. And on a couple of cases, they were saying, oh, we'll remove, the idea was, well, we don't want to hoist this thing up because you needed a lift and everything to get it up on a flatbed. And so they're like, well, we'll get it after closing. But the contract didn't specify that. It just said that sellers to remove the dollhouse. Well, if there's nothing in the contract that says that they're supposed to do it after closing, then they're supposed to do it before closing. And based on the merger doctrine, because it wasn't spelled out, it's supposed to be done before closing. Now, once it's closed, that has transferred, title is transferred over to the buyer. And when the seller pulled up with their truck and their equipment and removed property that belongs to the new owner, they were within the rights to say, no, that's not yours, because our child has now become attached to that in the last 3 hours that they've been in here, and you can't have it. And they're right. So if there's something that the seller wants to do after closing, or the buyer wants done after closing, that needs to be spelled out in the contract or an amendment that it can be done after closing. Otherwise, once it closes, you're left to just the good graces of the seller or buyer allowing you to get away with it. But contractually, you don't have, they can stop you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I have another question for either Jason or for Ned from Horace. Horace, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question, please.
Okay. I have the seller. She had planned to replace all the windows in her home because a couple had condensation. She then decided to sell the house, so the windows are custom. There's no sending them back. The house is set to close May 21st. Windows won't be arriving until June. So it's just kind of, since it's not a repair, didn't come up in the inspection, the house is being purchased by home partners. How do we do that? Because the agent for home partners is reluctant to put it into the contract because he's afraid it's going to ruffle home partners' feathers because there may be problems with the installation. So what do we do?
So you've got the seller in this one? Is that right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
So it's a buyer issue, because they're the ones that are or not going to get the windows. So, as long as you're selling, I assume what's happening is they're just going to show up at some point after closing, and the seller, so, if you, in this instance, because you've got the seller, there isn't necessarily anything that you need to do, because the seller says, hey, we closed, we're done, finished. And, the right thing for the seller to do is not interfere. Don't cancel the window order or anything like that.
No, well, she'll lose. I mean, she's going to lose anyway. I mean, the total windows is $22,000. She's already paid 11. She can't get her money back because they're custom windows. So she doesn't mind paying for them,
right?
Especially considering how much the house went for. But I don't know if the buyer agent is reluctant to add it to the contract to survive the close. I don't, I don't know how to handle it.
Again, that's one where there is no good, easy answer to it, because the parties don't, or at least the buyer's agent doesn't seem to want it on the contract or on an amendment. So that's one of these ones where either the buyer reaches out directly to the seller and says, hey, let's work this out somewhat on our own, or they're going to, if the buyer wants to be protected, they're going to have to put it in writing somehow, which means it's going to need to go through to underwriting. The only other thing they could do is they could have the buyer and the seller contact whoever it is that's supplying the windows, and have the seller just assign that work order to the buyer. And so at that stage, it is essentially handled outside the closing, because it's not part of the transaction. They've already paid $11,000 towards it, and they just say, hey, there's going to be a new owner and window supplier. you're going to be installing it for them instead of for me. That might help here. But ultimately, it's not really a seller concern because they're the ones that are going to be gone. It's going to be it's really more of a buyer concern.
Okay, because what I had thought about doing is just putting it into the escrow held aside for the install of the windows, so he gets paid, and just do it that way. I thought about.
As long as the buyer's lender is okay with it, the buyer lender are okay with it, that's fine. But usually the same ones that say, oh, we can't have that done.
There's no lender. It's a cash deal.
Okay, then yeah, that's certainly fine. They can do that.
Okay. I have another.
If there's no lender, then I'm not sure why the buyer's agent is reluctant to put it into the contract.
Because it's home partners, and
okay.
he's afraid that, he's talking about someone come out, taking windows out of the house. What if it's damaged? He's going to pay for it and all that stuff. So. Well,
it's an issue for the buyer to really address how they want it done. But yeah, they could certainly escrow it because there aren't any underwriting issues associated with it.
Okay. I have another kind of unrelated question I've been dying to ask, I guess. This happened a couple of years ago. I had a listing. I listed it. Next day she said she pulled it, said I'm sell to Zillow. I know the Zillow using my photo, so I emailed them saying, please don't use my photo. Next thing I know, I am cursed out, and I see a Facebook post where she identified someone at Zillow saying that I was suing her for commission, which of course I can't do. And it was only a $200,000 listing. I know no one's going to go to court over that. So should I just let that go? Because I don't like Zillow anyway. But if they're going around, according to her, Zillow said that I was suing her. So do I just let it go, or do I fight on principle, or?
I salute folks that want to fight on principle, but it can be awfully expensive.
Yeah.
So if it's not harming your business or your reputation, I personally might be inclined to just sort of let it go. Maybe put a response post somewhere that just says, no, I'm not suing anybody for a commission on this transaction or something like that, and let it go. But unless it's creating a problem for you.
Well, it cost me a deal, and then her daughter said in court as they was getting a divorce that I was suing her Zillow. So she mentioned that in an unrelated case in court, which generally kind of upset me. Said that lie is being repeated, but I know it can get kind of expensive.
That's one from what you described, I'd probably be inclined to let that one go.
There's another question in chat. Thank you, Horace. From Rohan Harrison. He is asking if you want to go ahead or she, I'm sorry, unmute and ask your question.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. Just wanted to make sure, as far as repairs are concerned, is there a document that I can have the buyer and seller sign, the buyer and the agent sign, that they actually did the walkthrough and they're accepting the property?
You could certainly create a document to that effect. There's not a form out there that I'm aware of, but you could certainly create one. Usually, once they usually just show up at closing. But you could certainly create a document that doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could just be, the undersigned acknowledge they have inspected the property and then found all repairs to be in acceptable condition.
But I don't need one, though. You're saying as long as we close, all bets are off then?
Yeah, once it's closed, the only exception to that is, because you can never get a straight answer out of a lawyer, of course. The only exception to that is if the repairs are done and on the surface it looks like they're done, but the buyer later learns that, hey, it was just cosmetic, you just sort of covered something up and concealed it, then the buyer's still going to have a claim based upon that fraud. But in general, if a repair is supposed to be made and it closed before closing, and once you get to closing, it closes, then whether it was made or not, that's how the buyer's taking the property.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
We now have a question from Christine Keppler. If you'd like to unmute, please.
Yes. Oh yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay. Yes, I just signed a new listing agreement and I'm not 100% clear because the son lived there and he's moving now to Florida to stay with his mom until the home sells. And so I don't know if I should mark it as a tenant occupied. I don't think he ever paid rent. That's one question. And then is it vacant or is it not vacant? I mean, he is basically vacationing until it sells right now. So he stayed there until yesterday. How do I, mark that on the listing?
Is the son's stuff still in the house, or is it truly empty?
His personal belongings are still in the home.
I would probably indicate, and the mother is the legal owner.
She's the legal owner, yes.
I would probably indicate that it was it's not really been rented, so I would just probably indicate that the owner hasn't occupied the property and how long that there's been a family member living there.
And put that in the private remarks.
Yeah, if you're going to explain something about it, I might just put owner hasn't occupied. A family member's been in the property. The owner has not been there for whatever time period.
And when because on the listing it says owner occupied or tenant occupied, what would you choose then?
I would probably put owner as opposed to tenant because it's not really a tenant so much, but you could go either way as long as you got the explanation that
Okay.
the situation is. And I don't know that it really matters.
Ned,
see.
I want to touch base on what you're saying. So if she were to say tenant occupied, typically whenever I list anything that's tenant occupied, the potential buyer might ask about proration of rent or security deposit. So then I would also suggest that if there's no lease and it's a month-to-month situation, there's no deposit, there's no rent, that should be clear as well.
Yeah, that's yeah. Usually if you're doing tenant occupied, they're expecting, okay, there's a real tenant in there where we may have to dispossess them or something along those lines. It's probably more marketable to say owner occupied.
Yes.
And then just put in the explanation that the owner themselves haven't been there, it's been a family member.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
One more question about new construction. We all know that this is a market with a lack of inventory, and the builders are, builders usually start construction 2 or 3 years before they start marketing. And right now, with the sharp increase of prices and materials, they are now holding firm to taking a buyer who went under contract 8 months ago and now holding them hostage. And Barbara asked the question about what's the recourse for a buyer if a builder contacts them and says, well, you can still close, but we need to increase the price by $11,000 or whatever the number is. Are you seeing some lawsuits there, and how should the agents handle that?
Yeah, it's a mess. That's a legal term, mess. The between COVID and price increases and construction delays and weather and everything else, people, I'm getting calls from buyers and they're like, I can't believe it, the builder's 6 months behind. I'm like, you're so far ahead of the game, you don't realize. A lot of builders are now putting in escalation clauses in their contracts saying that these are the current prices of their material. If they go up, the contract price goes up the same amount. You need to, and this is an area where, again, you need to deflect and defer back to, hey, buyer, you probably need to go talk to an attorney about this, because a lot of builders have their own custom contracts. The DYER forms are written to be more or less neutral, where they're designed to protect the broker and the agent, but they try to strike a relative balance between the buyer and the seller. Most developers, builders use their own custom contracts. And a lot of these contracts have what I in mixed company refer to as the I may jerk clause in them, that essentially is some flavor of, in the event the builder in builder's sole and absolute discretion determines that there is a dispute which in the builder's sole and absolute discretion cannot be resolved, then the builder in their sole and absolute discretion may terminate the contract by refunding all of the seller's deposits plus $100. And so suddenly the builder develops, hey, determines there's a dispute which could only be resolved by you paying me an extra $100,000. And if you're not willing to do that, then it can't be resolved, and I'm terminating the contract. See you bye. Alternatively, they're saying, yeah, there are delays, but too bad. You're still on the hook, and I'm going to retain your funds if you don't stay around and purchase the property. And often the builder is holding a large construction deposit, and they may be holding the earnest money. And so, sure, buyer, you may have a legitimate contractual basis on which to terminate, but it's the second iteration of the golden rule, which is he who has the gold tends to rule. And so if the builder's got your money, they're probably not going to voluntarily send it back to you if you're terminating against their wishes. And then you got to go file suit and chase after them for it. And it's one of these things where all you can do is tell buyers, hey, look, this is a custom contract. It's been written by the builder or for the builder. You should assume that it gives builder 100% of the rights and it gives you none of the rights. And it's not a standard form contract. So buyer, I'm happy to walk through it with you, but you probably ought to go talk to an attorney to make sure you understand what's in here.
Thank you for that. I'm going to pass it back over to Jason because he has to jump off in a few minutes. Jason, could you give us some final comments on your observation of compliance and just some words of wisdom for everyone that's on the call, please?
First, slow down. Second, read the contract. And third, if GAR put a blank, there probably needs to be something in that blank. So when in doubt, ask, don't leave it blank. And Ned, I thank you guys so much. I love the Practice Real Estate Safely video series that you guys have started doing. They have been a huge help in training, and especially in as reactive as we're having to be in the market that we're in now. Like the other day, the video about when you have multiple buyers that want the same property, like that was phenomenal. So thank you guys for doing that. Really appreciate it. But for everybody on the call, read the contract, especially if you're dealing with new construction and they pull out, you know, the DR Horton, here's the contract. That's not a GAR contract. Read it before your buyer signs it, so that they know, do they have to pay an extra 11 grand 8 months later? That's it.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. Y'all have a great day, okay? Go make some more money.
Thanks. Ned, there was another question, I think when Barbara was talking about the new construction, and Barbara, you jump in and unmute if I'm not answering or asking this question correctly. Should you file a list pending on there? And I know people tend to do that, and I know judges tend to look at that, you know, they don't like frivolous things added to a property. Can you speak on that, please?
Sure. So and some of it is kind of a nomenclature thing where it's a terminology thing. So a lis pendens is Latin for notice of action pending. A lis pendens does not exist unless there's a lawsuit filed in which the plaintiff, the person filing the lawsuit, is claiming and asserting an interest in the real estate. So you'll see it typically if a buyer is suing a seller for specific performance to force the seller to sell them the property. You will see a notice of lis pendens. What it does is it puts the world on notice that, hey, there's a buyer out here who's asserting that they're entitled to the real estate or some interest in the real estate. And so some other buyer, if you go purchase the property, you may be literally buying a lawsuit because you're taking that property subject to my pre-asserted claims. Sometimes folks will file a lien, which is different than a lis pendens. A lien is more typically, you know, mechanic, materialman, someone who's provided services or goods to the property. But one thing that we definitely need to avoid, there is no such thing as a brokerage lien unless it is a commercial property. And if you file any type of a lien or anything against the property saying that you're owed a commission on it and it's not commercial property, that is a Georgia Real Estate Commission violation. And so we don't want to be filing anything that deals with commissions. But there are cases sometimes where you have new construction and you have a particularly large deposit that the buyer pays on the property. And sometimes they might sue the builder, even though the deal was busted. They might sue them saying, hey, we paid $100,000 or $50,000 in construction deposits, and that money has been put into the property. And we think that the seller defrauded us somehow, and we should have an equitable lien against the property because the seller defrauded us into our $50,000. But that's not a conversation that anybody on this Zoom call should be having with anyone. That's something where, and I'm not trying to make work for lawyers, I'm just trying to put a layer of protection between you and a potential claim. That's definitely an area where you say to your buyer client, you probably need to go talk to an attorney.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ned. We're coming to the top of the hour. Do we have any more questions? Anyone want to unmute and ask one last question before we wrap up today's broker chat?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, who is that?
This Horace. I have a seller. I priced her house at 267. She's told me that, and I thought that she understood that, but she told me she won't accept an offer less than 280. And per the listing agreement, if she has an offer comes in that nets her above list price without no commissions aside, that she's owed commission, and she wants me to have that taken out because she won't accept the offer that doesn't get her 280.
So she wants to modify the listing, or she wants to modify the listing agreement?
She want to modify the listing agreement. I think it's section 8 that says if you receive a lawful bona fide offer that concessions even with concessions net you the list price, then and you reject that offer, you owe commission. And she wants to not owe commission because she only wants to accept an offer that will net her 280.
Yeah, I would take that up with the managing broker, the office manager for that, because we don't want to be waiving commission claims. There's also an issue of you may potentially owe a commission to the buyer's broker, depending on what comes in. But the way the DYER listing agreement reads is that if you receive an offer that's all cash, or at least the full purchase price in the listing with no contingencies, and it's got to close within 30, but not less than 30, not more than 45 days, and several other contingencies that have to be met, then you may be owed a commission even if the seller doesn't accept that offer. And so anytime if we are modifying or being asked to modify a listing agreement or a buyer brokerage agreement, I would always take that to the office and say, hey, is this okay or not okay? That's really a broker's to make.
Thank you, Horace. Well, Ned, we're at the top of the hour now, and I'll let you kind of give some parting words and good advice, but we're at the end of our hour. We'll do this again in 2 weeks, I think. So if you have broker chat questions, send those in early. That way we can cover that. And I thank everyone for being here. And Ned, I know you're extremely busy based on what you've already told us you're doing. So we thank you for taking an hour of your time today. And I'll just give you the final words.
My pleasure. It's been great talking to everybody. Slow it down just a smidge. I know nobody can slow it down as much as I'd want you to, but slow it down just a smidge. Go through and just check to make sure I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and try to have fun with this crazy market, because it is throwing us all kinds of challenges. Go old school on stuff. Do this. Pick up a phone, call the other side. As much as texting is awesome, it doesn't count as proper notice under the DYER contract, and so much can be lost in translation between text and messages and emails. Pick up the phone and call the other side, and just to confirm, hey, I sent you something. Just want to make sure you got it. And, or there's an issue. So much more can be worked out that way. So be safe out there.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day. Go sell some real estate and stay safe. We put the, I put Ned's name and his email if you want to thank him or send him a quick question. Keep in mind that he does charge by the hour. But anyway, you guys be good. Have a good day and go sell some real estate safely. Thank you.
Thank you.